Hi, this is Andy. One of my joys as the host of the People and Projects podcast is introducing you to experts who can help you lead and deliver. And a couple of months back, the authors of a new guide on project, program, and portfolio governance reached out to see if we wanted to feature it on the podcast. Now, I got to tell you, most of our episodes are focused on the people side of delivering, so it was not an automatic yes for me. But after I reviewed their guide, I wanted to have this conversation today, and here's why. There's so much focus on the technical aspects of project management, like get a signed off charter and get a shared understanding of scope and break the work down into a WBS and risk management. By the way, all those things are good and necessary at the project level. But a common theme I see across clients is how they struggle with governance, which is a different thing. In fact, frankly, I think plenty of organizations can't clearly communicate what governance means or even looks like, or if they can, there's not a shared understanding of it across their projects, programs, and portfolios. So today I'm excited to introduce you to Ross Garland, a co-author of the Project, Program, and Portfolio Governance Guide. I think it's fair to say that Ross is one of the true gurus of governance, and he joins us today for a conversation about that topic. Before this episode wraps up, you'll know what Cobbs Paradox is and why it is still persisting. You'll have a clear idea of what governance is and even clarity on the difference between projects, programs, and portfolios. We'll talk about a couple of the principles in their guide and then take a look at how they can be applied to an actual project. If you're responsible for leading and delivering initiatives, you're going to find this discussion helpful, and it might just be one you want to forward to your boss as well. Hey, but first, if you've been listening for a while, you know about our course, AI Made Simple, right? It's a practical guide to using AI in your everyday work. Reviews keep coming in about how people are finding it helpful. If you've not already gone through it yet, I invite you to join other listeners from around the world who are using these tools to help them save time. Learn more and join us at ai.peopleandprojectspodcast.com. Thanks. Well, let's jump into today's discussion with Ross about his guide on governance. Ross, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you very much, Andy. I'm happy to be here.
I'm so glad this worked out. In the introduction, I mentioned Cobb's Paradox. So how do you like to explain that, and why do you think it has so stubbornly persist?
Well, let's talk about what it is first. So Cobb came up with this belief that we know why projects fail. I'm reading it here. We know why projects fail. We know how to prevent their failure. So why do they still fail? Now, you have to unpick Cobb's Paradox, yeah? You just can't take it on face value. So the first thing that you need to do, we have a reasonable, whenever a major project fails, we understand, or there's analysis undertaken as to why it fails. And just out of interest, that is seldom down to project management. Very seldom is it down to project management. It's more about things like stakeholder management. It's often about things like governance. But he states we know how to prevent their failure. I question that, to be honest with you, because in my experience, one of the reasons myself and my co-author wrote this guide is that we didn't feel there was much specific guidance about governance out there. Now, when I say that, there's books about governance, but we wrote this book from the perspective that if you're called into the boss's office and the boss says, we've got problems on this project, I think it's to do with governance, go in and fix it. Where do you start? Well, you start with the guide. Myself, my co-author, Adrian Morey, we're consultants. We've been consultants for way too many years now, as you can tell from all the great work. And so we wrote it from that perspective. From a consultancy perspective, when you're called into the office, you have to have the answers. This gives you the answers in terms of governance. Now, back to Cobb's paradox. Why do they still fail? That's an interesting point too, isn't it? It's what do you mean by failure? Because most projects muddle through. They get through one way or another. They produce an output. Yeah, they produce assets. And particularly if they're government projects, ministers tend to be very happy because they get to cut the ribbon. They cut the ribbon on a brand shining new asset. But that's not what we should be focused on, because the majority of projects, while they do produce outputs, quite often they produce suboptimal outcomes. So they're a little bit over budget, or they're a little bit behind schedule, or they produce the business outcomes that the business wanted, but not quite all the business outcomes they needed. They had certain benefits that they were very keen on realizing, but they weren't all realized. That, to me, constitutes suboptimal outcomes. And what we try and do with the governance framework is put in place a framework that eliminates, to the extent possible, errors in decision making so that you get the best possible outcome. So Cobbs Paradox, yes, but you have to know what you're talking about, I think, when you read it.
I love it. That's great. I appreciate the nuance. Just to make sure we're on the same page, because I think there's a chance, Ross, that if a boss said to some of our listeners, I think the problem is governance, go fix it, they may not know what that means. So how do you like to describe what governance is? And if you allow, like what it's not?
Yeah, so governance. So we refer to P3G, project, program, and portfolio governance. And what it's fundamentally about is decision-making on projects, programs, and portfolios, and making sure that decision-making is as efficient and effective as possible. So what it's not management. It's not about managing the project. The project manager is one of the key decision makers, clearly, on a project, but there are certain decisions that will need to be made that are not in the project manager's remit and shouldn't be in the project management's remit. They're at a higher level. And that's where you have things like project boards and so forth. And one of the important things that we talk about in the guide is when you're talking about decision making, on any significant project or program, there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions that are going to be made over its lifetime. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, who makes what decisions? And so in the guide, we worked it out. You need a rule of thumb as to, is this the project manager's decision to make, or should it go to the board, or should it even go up to an investment committee or a portfolio committee? Did that help?
I think that makes a lot of sense. Oh yeah, for sure. It does, for sure. Yeah. Thank you for actually clarifying that. And although this is going to sound like a really basic question to you, just to make sure everyone's on the same page, and I think you've already started this in some ways, is the difference on how you see projects, programs, and portfolios. Like you have some specific images in the guide that kind of talk about what each of those are destined to do or designed to do. So how do you like to differentiate those?
Yeah, and it's important to differentiate them actually, because fundamentally projects are largely about producing outputs. Now, you will have some projects that will also realize benefits. We refer to them as standalone projects. But the bigger and more complex a project becomes, you find that it tends to be comprised of multiple components. Now, those components might be assets, but there'll be some business change issues around it. There'll be transitional aspects to it. There'll be HR aspects to it. So you'll find that you've got this complex group of related activities. And when it's sufficiently complex, the best way to govern it is as a program, because a program is a collection of strategically related projects, which, when they're delivered in a coordinated manner, give you business outcomes and benefits. So just to give you an example, I've been doing some work recently for a very large multinational mining company. And they were talking to me. They decided that they needed to improve their governance. And they started talking to me about their biggest project. And their biggest project was $25 billion US. So absolutely huge. And as soon as they said their biggest project was $25 billion US, I just thought to myself, no, it's not. No, it's not. Your biggest program is $25 billion, because this mining project consisted of developing a mine, developing a processing plant. All of these are over $1 billion. Developing a railway line to get the product out. Developing a highway to get things to and from the site. Upgrading a pork facility. All of those are major projects in their own right. Now, if you treat them as just a project, you're going to undergovern it. You're not going to have enough governance in place. You're not going to have the business people focused on the port development, the railway development, and exactly what outcomes they need from those developments. So that's the difference between projects and programs. Once projects get to a level of complexity, you're almost certainly in the program space. The portfolio is simply the combination, the grouping of all the projects and programs that an organization is undertaking. So it's total investment in projects and programs.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think a lot of people listening to us would have some familiarity with standards and publications from organizations like Project Management Institute or maybe Association for Project Management. I'm just curious how you would compare and contrast your guide with, say, PMI's practice guide for governance of portfolios, programs, and projects. Because at least from a title perspective, someone might say, pick one or the other. But I think there's some differences here.
I think there's some significant differences there, to be honest with you, Andy. Now, without going into the detail, I've recently been out in Saudi Arabia. They've got some huge projects out there. And they've had their Global Project Management Forum, which is a PMI event. And I think it's the largest in the world. And the person organizing it asked me last year and again this year to come out and talk about the guide. And the reason they did that is that they didn't feel they were getting the answers from the PMI practice guide. And they also believed that there wasn't a lot of take up of that guide. Now, I'm not here to diss the PMI's
For sure.
governance guide, but that's been my experience of it. And I've been to many other PMI events as well. And I think two things strike a chord with these people. The first is that it's principles based. It's not a process based guide, it's principles based. And the other thing is what I was referring to before. It's very much practice focused. It's aimed at the person who needs to put governance in place for the project or program.
Yeah. Just for what it's worth, I did a search today through PMIs and there was no reference to agile or hybrid. So for example, because in 2016, when that was published, that wasn't as much of a focus, and you can't go through your guide without noticing that you don't ignore it, right? I mean, it is a part of how you think about, because in practice, that's going on in some places.
Oh, very much so, and becoming more common with every passing day. And agile is interesting, isn't it? Because I've struck it in many organizations now. Sorry, not organizations, but in projects and programs, where a project manager will, I'll be asking about the governance or, the documentation they have. And they say, oh, we don't do that. We're agile. And it's becoming an excuse to go documentation light. And in some cases, that documentation is also governance documentation. And the way to approach it is, it doesn't matter what approach you use, what methodology you use. It's not your money. You have to justify the investment and you have to govern that investment. So it doesn't matter how you're doing it, but it has to be governed.
Yeah, you do a really good job in the book of just making that very clear. I thought you stayed very agnostic of approach. It doesn't matter the approach, right? Because that's at a lower level. I thought that was really well done. And you did, just like you said, it's organized around principles, which I appreciated, because it seems to me it's easier to scale or tailor the ideas when they're principles instead of specific processes. So to give listeners a taste of what's included in the guide, let's just start with the first principle: to treat change differently from business as usual. Because you mentioned in the guide that an organization chart is not typically designed to govern change. So tell us about that and why this principle is so important.
Yeah, well, it's critically important. Business as usual is basically governed through the mechanism of the organization chart. So you put everybody who's working for a particular person on a particular area in one area of the business, and it's inline decision making. It's very straightforward, efficient decision making. But the problem with projects and programs is that they impact stakeholders from across the business. And in order to have efficient decision making, you can't constantly be going both up the inline decision-making path, then across, then back, then up, then down, and so forth. It simply doesn't work. So the org chart isn't designed for projects and programs. So consequently, what we do in the project and program space, and this is no news to any of your listeners, is we get the key stakeholders and we put them together in a project board or a steering committee, whatever you want to call it. And that means you can get more effective decision-making.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think you equate in that change as projects are about change, because I think as obvious as that sounds, I think sometimes people don't necessarily equate those those two. But the reason why we're doing this project is change. And so think of it as separating business as usual from change. I think that I agree. It's just a critical part.
Yeah, it's interesting. You make a good point there, because I'm used to, you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm used to the Australian project environment and also the UK project environment. I'm living in the UK at the moment. And the collective term for projects and programs in those environments is often change. That's how they refer to them. So yes, change is very much the projects and programs, and in total the portfolio that helps the business change from where it is now to where it wants to be in the future.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You know, the second principle is to ensure a single point of accountability for each project or program. And I thought it was nice how you differentiated accountability from responsibility. So I'd love for you to tell us about that. And then also you mentioned the importance of having a single person accountable as opposed to a committee or board. So I'd like to have you comment on both of those.
Yeah, sure. If you think about a project, ideally what you want, well, let's start with a project and we talk about that single point of accountability. Now that person, in the guide we refer to them as the project sponsor, they're accountable for the success of the project. That's a huge accountability. But within that accountability, to realize that accountability, there's multiple responsibilities. So there's things that need to get done. So responsibilities are task oriented. You'll be given a responsibility to produce a schedule for the project. You'll be given a responsibility for cost control on the project. But for all those responsibilities, there tends to only be a handful of pure accountabilities at that top level. And as I say, that important accountability is accountability for the success of the project. Now, why it's important is because it's about empowerment. So if you have a project board or a program board, on a complex program, it can be difficult to keep a program board into single digits. Yeah, it can be very difficult. If you go over single digits, you've got a decision-making issue on your hands because there's too many people. So if you've got 8 or 9 people on a program board, you don't want that to turn into a talk fest. It has to be very decision-focused. So the concept of single point of accountability is that you identify the best placed person to be accountable for the success of that project or program. And then that gives them the empowerment to break through this whole process of consensus decision-making and make decisions to push the whole thing forward. They tend to be the chair of the committee. They are the person who must agree every decision that comes out of that project board or program board. So it's not, there tends to be in some organizations, a very unfortunate tendency to think that accountability is about who to blame when things go wrong. And that is not the case. It's about empowerment. If an organization has a process in place that stipulates how they identify who's accountable for the success of a project, and then it's a transparent process that they use, and it's a logical process that they use. If they've got those 3 things in place, then when they announce who the person is who's accountable for that project or program, the organization, all of those in the project space in the organization will go, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, agree with that. And that empowers them, because what are those people now expecting? They're expecting them to make decisions. Now, one other point I made there, I said about they have to agree with every decision that goes out of that program board or project board. That's a correct statement, but don't get me wrong. They're not acting as a dictator. 99% of the decision making on a project or a program is likely to be by consensus. Everybody agrees that it's the best way forward. If you ever end up with a project or a program where that's not the case and people are arguing every point, then you've got a project or a program that will fail. So it's just about breaking that consensus approach and making sure that the project continues to drive forward.
You know, one person told me at their organization, the company coat of arms was, and if somebody's just listening to us, they can't see me do it, but fingers crossed, pointing opposite directions in front of them. The company coat of arms is this, people pointing, they're not making there's no ownership there. And I heard one executive say, I just want one throat to choke, which is kind of a funny way of saying it, but it gets back to almost like the punitive point of the accountability instead of the ownership side of it. But there's still value in getting that one person, right?
Yeah, well, hopefully that manager was using that in a throwaway sense, because right. I can see where they're coming from. You might end up in a situation where you've got a complex project or program and it's not fully clear who is in charge. Now, that's a horrible situation for an organization to find themselves in. And that's why you put in place governance frameworks. Yeah.
So many other principles are offered, but we'll have our listeners get a copy of the guide to understand them all. But for now, let's see how some of these ideas work in practice. Because I told you before we started recording that chapter 5 was one of my favorites in the sense of just examples of applying the principles. So let's say someone's working in a mid-sized organization. They want to replace an important system. Let's say it's a payroll system, more than a decade old, lots of paper, manual processes, vendor support is ending, and they want to replace this with a software as a service solution. So how might your principles guide them in that sort of initiative?
Okay, so first of all, let's start with principle 1, that you need that differentiation between business as usual and change. For some organizations, it's interesting. Most of the organizations that I deal with, they look at that principle and they say, yeah, we know that. We already know that. And yet most of the organizations that I deal with also get it wrong, and they don't realize they're getting it wrong. And the way they get it wrong, and most of your listeners are going to recognize this. If you have a project or a program and you put a board in place, and so the board is governing that project or program. Hopefully there's a project sponsor who's the chair of the board and accountable for the success of the project. And they make a decision, but you'll see a governance framework. They'll draw out a governance framework and it shows the project board, shows the project and so forth. But then they'll have a line going from the project board and the project sponsor up to the divisional manager. Yeah. And this, the divisional manager, hugely experienced person. And I think it's in the guide, isn't it? I think it's one of the examples I give in the guide, certainly in the course. And it seems sensible that the divisional manager does sign off decisions made by the project board. But think about the implications of that. The organization thinks it's got a single point of accountability, the project sponsor. But how accountable can they be if somebody else can override their decisions? So that's the first question. The second question you ask yourself is, the organization chose the project sponsor because they were the best placed person to lead that project. But now they're no longer making the decisions. The divisional manager is the next best placed person. So they've gone against what they intended in the first place. And the other problem it causes is delays. It causes delays in decision making because the decisions have to go up, come back down again. That can take weeks. Once worked with a guy who decided to resign because he simply couldn't take it any longer. The delays were so great. And the other thing it does is what you'll find is that on your project board, you'll have senior executives supporting that project sponsor on the project board, and they will realize that they're no longer being treated as decision makers because the decisions are going up. So what do? They start sending substitutes to the board meetings. So for all your listeners out there, if you're interested and you're working on a project or a program now, have a look at the last 3 months of minutes of the board meetings and see how many substitutes were there. And the number of substitutes directly correlates to how well that governance framework's working. But I've gone way off topic here, haven't I?
Oh, but it's interesting.
I've gone way off topic. So we were saying, how would the book help? So in terms of knowing who to make project sponsor, the book Principle 3 deals with that. And it's hugely important because some organizations still have the concept that the experts in project management should be the people leading projects. Now, if you do that, what you end up with is lovely assets, but not business outcomes. You invest in a project or program to get business outcomes. So the guide tells you how to identify who that business person is to achieve those business outcomes. And then, of course, the key project delivery person sits beside them on the project board. And so you get that lovely tension between the business and delivery, working it out together, the best way forward to get the best outcomes. So principles like that, principles about decision making. I can't remember, I think it might be Principle 8, which talks about who makes what decisions, decision-making rights. That's clearly important. Like many of your listeners, I presume, are likely to be project managers. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the loneliest positions in the world you can have is to be a project manager who needs to get decisions made. And when they look up in the governance structure, all they see is blue sky. It's not clear who's making the decisions. So from the project manager's perspective, even though a lot of this guide is focused on the decision making at board level, it's hugely important that the project manager understands how it operates, for the simple reason, if it's not working properly, they're the one that are going to be blamed. It's always the project manager that gets it in the neck, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and plus, if they get clarity, they can know what decisions they can make without even moving it up, waiting for decisions, right? So we can get clarity of what decisions can we make here, so that can speed things up.
Yeah, no, exactly.
You know, when you hear from people who've used the guide, which I think must be very gratifying for you, what are you glad to hear that is getting a lot of attention? And what's one thing that you think isn't talked about as much, but you think is important?
Glad about. I remember I had one person, a client, who read the guide, and she thought, her view was that I must have had a microphone in their office and I didn't know what was wrong. So it's very gratifying when people say, oh yeah, that's happening in our organization. I've seen that in our organization. And all the guide is doing is saying, this is what happens and this is why it happens and this is what you do to get around it. So that sort of thing is very gratifying, where people are using the guide and finding that what it's talking about reflects their lived experience. The other thing that comes up occasionally, I had one person very early on in the piece, didn't say it to me, they put it on LinkedIn, and they just said, you've got to get this because the appendices have got all these useful tools, so templates for governance frameworks. So I'll be talking about governance frameworks today, but where do you start? Well, you start in appendix, whatever it is, of the guide. Right. And they said it saved them days and days and days of work trying to dream it up themselves. And instead, they were able to use the appendix. So there's lots of stuff in there that will help people either at that tactical level, having in place the appendices, but also people should be able to relate to most of the principles from their experiences in their own organization. So they've seen some of the difficulties and they will see, I hope, that the guide shows how to address those difficulties.
I was going to ask you like what your best pitch is for why someone should get the copy of the guide, but I think you just gave it right there. I mean, save them time, help them understand, give them a roadmap. Where can someone find this guide if they wanted to take the next step?
Oh, you can buy it. All good bookstores should have it. Certainly, if you Google it, it will pop up. The TSO, which stands for the Stationery Office. They used to be the government printers in the UK. And you may have heard of the Axelos Suite, what was once referred to as the Axelos Suite, Prince 2, MSP, Management of Portfolios, Managing Benefits, all those things. They were the publishers of that suite. So they're the publishers of the book. So the TSO, you can get it from it. You can also get it from digital copies from our website, which is called P3G QA, which is the P3G Qualification Authority.com. You can get it from there. So yeah, a quick Google and you can find it in all sorts of places now, and becoming more all the time. We're working on the Arabic translation at the moment. We expect to have an Arabic version out by the end of the year. Because the number of big projects in the Middle East is just mind-blowing, really.
Yeah. Well, for those listening, if you've resonated with this discussion, get a copy of Ross's guide about project, program, and portfolio governance. I put links to the guide and Ross's website in the show notes for this cast. So, hey, Ross, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
You're welcome, Andy. I've enjoyed it.